And so it sounds like there was a lot put on the table. There were a lot of benchmarks out there. So looking at the 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, Ken, what has actually been accomplished so far?
Well, I think the biggest accomplishments have been the House gifts that Corey mentioned, which are the individual commitments that nations made about what they were going to do on their own territory. And I think somewhere in the range of over 75% of those commitments have been implemented. Some of them haven't yet been implemented and may be over the next few weeks. But there's been good progress on that part of it. The communique had a lot of detail in it, but not a lot of requirement that nations actually adhere to the specific elements of it. It was much more voluntary. So I think that some of that has been accomplished, not all of it, and I'm hopeful that in Seoul that document will be improved and made a little bit stronger and have some requirement that we help improve the system and that countries be required to take steps to improve their security.
Great. So let's focus now a little bit on the Seoul summit itself. Corey, in your opinion, why do you think Korea was chosen to host the summit?
Well, first and foremost, Korea volunteered, and I think that this, from what I heard from those who were in the room, the states were very welcoming of this South Korean effort and South Korea putting itself forward as a leader. This is really consistent with where South Korea has positioned itself on these issues in the past few years. And it comes from both a political leadership as well as a commercial leadership standpoint. On the political leadership, South Korea has really recognized that as a really fully emerged democracy and economy in East Asia, it can play a very significant leadership role on the nuclear issue as well as the broader regional security issues. At the same time, South Korea is trying to, and in some cases has already succeeded in, becoming an exporter of nuclear technology. South Korea is the 5th largest user of nuclear energy for electricity production in the world, but they are now looking to sell their reactors abroad, and they have done so with the United Arab Emirates buying a reactor from them. And so as South Korea looks to be a commercial player, their kind of political bona fides, their political leadership is even more important on issues of security and non-proliferation to make sure that they're in the strongest stead possible as they are really playing on this arena.
In South Korea, Ken, do you expect the same type of agenda to be on the table as we've had at the 2010 summit? Are there new things that are going to be talked about? What's it going to be about?
I think the core of the summit is going to be the same as Washington in the sense that the prevention of nuclear terrorism will be the key issue. And I think that everyone will be focused on that. But there are going to be a few other additional issues that are on the agenda. The first of which is the fallout from Fukushima and what the interface, as people are calling it, between nuclear safety, which is how you make reactors operate safely, and nuclear security, which is very different, which is about the protection of the materials, interact together. And the reason is because there's a general sense that if the Fukushima accident was an intentional act of terrorism, the system is not adequately prepared to deal with those consequences and those implications. So that's going to be one very important issue, and it goes to what Corey said about the commercial aspects of nuclear power, because there's a desire, I think, to improve the safety and security of nuclear power installations so that they're viewed as safe sources of energy as the population on the globe increases, as resources for oil and gas begin to decrease, and so that's a very important objective. The second new issue that will be on the agenda is related to radiological security. Radiological security is very different than nuclear security. Nuclear security is about the materials that you can make a nuclear bomb out of. They're big. A nuclear bomb is, reasonably large, especially an improvised one. And radiological sources, especially high-intensity radiological sources that are used in hospitals and things like that, from which you can make a dirty bomb, are incredibly small. In fact, one radiological source is not much bigger than your thumb. And if you surround that with some explosive, you will contaminate some significant amount of a city, and it will be uninhabitable until it's cleaned up, and it will be expensive, it will be economically devastating, and it will not allow people to live in that zone. So those two issues are new on the agenda. There are a few others that are more technical, but I think that those are going to take not equal place to nuclear terrorism, but second and third.
And Corey, I know you work a lot in the region, and certainly on the industry side as well. And you mentioned that there's going to be an industry summit as well around the nuclear security summit. Are there other issues that you think might pop up? You mentioned nuclear power. Ken mentioned radiological issues. Of course, North Korea is the big elephant in the room. Will North Korea be talked about? If so, how? How does that play into specifically the Seoul Security Summit?
North Koreans will not participate in the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, and I don't expect that the North Korean nuclear issue, as primarily a proliferation issue, will be a central point of discussion for the summit and the summit participants. And nor will the issue of Iran, for example, which is another kind of hot proliferation issue in the world. We have a situation where, some people want this summit to be all things and cover all issues, and it really can't. For this summit to be valuable, it needs to keep its focus on preventing nuclear terrorism primarily, and some of these related issues of radiological terrorism and the safety security interface, for example, where that all is contributive to a discussion of nuclear terrorism. We all agree that North Korea, Iran, nuclear disarmament, broader issues are important, but this is not the venue to deal with all of those issues. That being said, I would expect that, any time when you get this many leaders together, there are likely to be some very interesting discussions on the margins, and I think there may be opportunities in Seoul to make progress on issues such as the North Korean nuclear issue, but not in the formal summit setting.
What are some expected outcomes of the summit? What can we expect? Kenny talked about progress. 75% or more of the accomplishments have been completed. What else can we expect to see in terms of outcomes from this Seoul Security Summit?
Well, I think, again, at this summit, the individual national commitments, the so-called house gifts, will be probably the most tangible. There's going to be something new this year, which is called gift baskets, which is groups of nations making similar commitments that are grouped together, which I think is actually a very useful innovation from Washington. And then there'll be another communique. I expect, again, the communique to lay out some of the key issues without requiring compliance with them, and I expect the house gifts and the gift baskets to be the most concrete. But I think equally important to the outcome of the summit is what happens after the summit, and that is what leadership role the Korean government and the U.S. government and other governments are going to play leading into the next summit in the Netherlands, and whether or not we can try to close some of the gaps that exist in the regime that governs nuclear security, and whether by the end of that process in Amsterdam or wherever it may be in the Netherlands, that we've made some real progress on unifying and strengthening nuclear security regime overall. So,
Corey, go
ahead. My expectations are rather ambitious for this summit, and that's partially because I think if this process is going to continue, it has to be stronger every time. It's not enough to rehash what we did in Washington. And while there are a number of very important individual commitments and places where states have grouped together, the real significant issue is, can we establish a set of priorities on nuclear security issues for the global agenda as a whole? And I think until we do that, we're going to have these pockets of progress. Each one may be important, but it doesn't lead to an overall significant and sustainable improvement and reducing the risk of nuclear terrorism to the point where we really need it to go. And I think this vision for the future will be what I'm really hoping to see out of the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul.
No question. Vision is the key, and Seoul has got to be the pivot point toward the vision. Yes. Washington was easy to call a success because it was the first of its kind, and it actually achieved some modest progress.
Well, last question for both of you. What can citizens do to be involved? We've talked a lot about what officials and governments can do and what the expectations are, what has been accomplished, but what can citizens do? What can people watching at home do?
Well, there are two things. One is that the summit itself is going to be surrounded by two other events. And let me just talk about one of them, which is the Expert Symposium. This is an international symposium of experts that are coming to Seoul on the Friday before the summit to talk about issues related to nuclear terrorism and nuclear security. They will be from all different countries. The audience is from a variety of different countries, including representatives from all of the countries that will be at the summit in Seoul. And the topic is going to be what the non-governmental community, the expert community, and citizens can do to assist governments with their nuclear terrorism prevention objectives.
The second event is for the nuclear industry to come together because, of course, where the implementation is, where the rubber hits the road on nuclear security, it has to be done at the facility level with the nuclear industry. The other final thing is leaders won't come together if they don't think their citizens care about this issue. So leaders need to hear that citizens think this is important and think it's worth their time.
Great. Well, thank you both for being here. Thank you for the viewers at home for watching. I'm Alexandra Toma for Asian America, presenting to you today.
If you have any comments,